In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to write a sine or cosine equation given the particulars of the graph. For example, we're going to see that the amplitude is 2, the period is 4, phase shift is 1/2, and the vertical shift is 4. All of this information helps me identify what the A, B, C, and D are of the graph. And then you're going to write it in one of these forms. So the amplitude, we're going to make equations here. So I know the amplitude is 2. That means the A is going to equal 2. The phase shift. So each of these we're going to identify. In order to get the phase shift, you have to get the B from the period. So the period is 4. And again, I won't worry about that absolute value. So it's cross multiplying and solving. 4b equals 2 pi. Therefore, b is equal to pi over 2 when you simplify. Now that you know what your b is, you can determine what your c is. So the phase shift is equal to 1/2. And therefore, your negative c over b pi over 2, because I just got my b equals pi over 2, and I just substituted in for my b here. And so at this point I would cross multiply, so it's going to be 2 equals a negative 2c over pi. And when you solve for c, you end up with c is equal to a negative pi. The vertical shift is equal to 4. Now that you've identified your A, B, C, and D, you can rewrite the equation. Y equals your A2 sine. B is pi over 2. C is plus minus pi, so you would copy the plus down, and minus pi would be minus pi. And then your D would be 4, and that's going to be your answer. Looking at the next problem, doing the same type of thing. In this case, your A equals 1.2. The period, it doesn't say anything about. So the period is going to be equal to 2 pi, just as normal. So your B is equal to 1 if you solve for B. Phase shift, 3 pi over 2. Your B equals 1. So your C is equal to a negative 3 pi over 2. And the vertical shift is 1. At this point, again, you can write the equation. Y equals 1.2 sine. B is 1, so it's going to be x plus negative, means minus 3 pi over 2, plus your D, which is 1, and that's going to be your equation. Now, given any maximum or minimum point on a graph and the period, you can determine what all of these A, B, C's, and D's are. For example, if I'm given a story problem and it says the max is a certain value and the min is a certain value, and you either know the full period or half the period, let's say that's just going from 1 to 11, then you can determine all of the information. So the amplitude, you would know, is going to be half the distance from the sinusoidal axis. That's your A value. Your period is going to be twice this, so the period is going to be this length and this length. So you would double 10 to get your period, and therefore you can get your B. And so now you have your A and your B. Your phase shift now, What I'm looking for is what is the shift of the point at where it's your starting point. So for example, I'm looking at this point right here because it starts in the middle and goes up. That's a positive sign graph. So in this case, I would use a positive sign. It's the least distance from the y-axis. If I were to use this point, the distance would be greater, but I could still use the cosine, positive cosine general graph. However, I like to have everybody on the same page and think what is the least distance and have the graph positive. The only exception to that is if, say, example, that this point was lined up on the y-axis, I would use a negative cosine because it lines up perfectly. Or if this were coming down like this and it's lined up perfectly with a negative sign graph, then I would use the negative sign. But the rules would be, for me, use the sine or cosine that has the least phase shift unless it lines up exactly with the y-axis, and then you can use the negative graphs. The only other part to this is what is the vertical shift. And the vertical shift is going to be from the sinusoidal axis to the x-axis. That concludes how to get general equations given details, either the details of the graphs or a graph itself in finding and given the min and the max and the period or half the period.